As a review for any of you who have been already practicing with JournalSpeak, and for anyone who's new, the practice is about that expression, right? Like I mentioned before, it's about processing information that has otherwise not had the opportunity to been processed in a safe and comforting kind of space within ourselves. So we set aside a total of 30 minutes of time in a private space. I don't generally recommend doing JournalSpeak like on the subway, heading to work or something like that, where you're in other people's space and where you could be interrupted, because there really is so much symbol and metaphor that comes through doing this practice. First of all, we're making this commitment to ourselves to show up, to create, sacred space for ourselves. We create privacy in time and space, and we ask that we're left alone. We close the door and we create sacred space by saying to ourselves, you can come here for these 20 minutes. We're going to be contained and we're going to just write it out. We're going to say anything that comes up, anything goes, because no one's ever going to read this again and no one is going to judge it, not even me. And so, there's a lot, especially when you think of relationships with children and our inner child, there's something really important about making and keeping promises. With little kids, like, it doesn't matter really what the promise is, but if you break it, you're in big trouble. So we want to kind of keep that trust building process at the forefront of our practice with JournalSpeak. So I always tell people, we do recommend that you do it every day, especially if you're somewhat new to JournalSpeak and you really want to get the momentum going. But I always say, if not being able or not being willing to do it every day is going to stop you from doing it altogether, then I much prefer that you make a commitment to do it once a week even, or, every other day, or whatever the frequency is that you can stick to. Just by making and keeping that commitment to yourself to show up, make space, and do the work is huge, huge in re-nourishing that relationship between you and you. So we set aside a time and space, 20-minute timer. We have our notebook. I recommend like a legal pad or, just plain paper. You really don't need a fancy, sexy notebook for this that you're going to keep forever and ever, because you're not. And you set the timer for 20 minutes, turn it away so you're not checking the time, and you just write. You begin writing, and if you've got a prompt, you can put that at the top of the page, whether it's, why am I so sad today? Or the argument with so-and-so. It can be anything that's just at the top of your mind that you need to be writing about. But we also always want to stay open, because oftentimes our mind will move us around and jump to new subjects. And so a prompt is not to be rigid, it's just a jumping off point. And I'll talk about the 3 lists a little bit in a moment. And those are another great place, obviously, to get prompts. If you don't have something at the top of your mind to start writing about, you can pull from those 3 lists. But I want to say also about the timer. A lot of people ask me if they get to about 15 minutes in and they just, a lull kind of happens and they feel like they're just done. Is it okay to just stop at 15 minutes? Why 20 minutes? And the answer is that it's actually really important to keep going, because that lull, which is actually very common to happen around 15 minutes in, is a way of your subconscious mind being like, did I give you enough? Can we stop now before things might get even juicier? And if you take that opportunity to stop, you really might miss out on some really powerful things. And what I have seen, certainly in my own experience and heard from many, many people, is that minute 17 to 19 is where some really big, juicy stuff can come out. So that's kind of part of why we say to turn the timer away, because we don't want you getting in your own way by watching the clock or trying to change the process. And again, if you think about that commitment to yourself, when you say, if you said to a little kid, like, hey, let's go to the park for an hour. And then after 45 minutes, you're like, I'm kind of done. Let's go home. They might be really upset with you because you said it was going to be an hour. And it doesn't seem like much, but again, we're working on these levels of gesture, and symbol and metaphor in this relationship with ourselves. So it's important to keep to our word. Yeah, so I think these are great opportunities for like communing with ourselves and finding the answer to that question in the moment, because it's not going to be just, I can't give you one answer to carry over for every situation. So in some cases, that stuff might come up, and it may have come up at minute 18 because your subconscious feels like it can only handle 2 minutes of looking at that. And that's totally acceptable. It might also have come up at the very end because it's like, maybe I can, share a little bit and then we'll get away from it, even though that's not what we need. So the best thing to do is like check in with yourself in that moment. For one thing, what's next on my schedule? Do I actually have time to extend this a little further, look at this more directly now, and still be able to do my self-compassion and transition before moving on to the next part of my day? Or do I need to make a commitment right now that tomorrow I'm coming back, or this evening when I have more time, I'm coming back and we're going to look at this again more directly now that we know that it's there? Because that's a huge part of that compartmentalization process too. It's the same thing where, if you're out in your, public or in your social settings and something intense comes up, we can't always actually, express ourselves fully in that moment or fully address that in that moment. And we can't necessarily always run to the bathroom for a quick journal speak either. And so that's part of our learning process, is being able to acknowledge something is coming up. And if it's not the right moment for me to really, dig in with this right now, then I'm making a commitment that I will come back in so many hours or in so many days to when I'm going to have the space to really, contain this and hold space for myself around it. After the timer goes up, then the reason why I say to get 30 minutes total at least, you really want to spend at least 10 minutes after writing with self-compassion. And this could be a guided meditation on self-compassion. Someone put a comment on the meditation that I gave you guys and asked if that could be good to do after JournalSpeak. And I say, absolutely. I think that's a great one. But it can really be anything that gets you feeling soothed and a bit comforted and in alignment with yourself out of whatever state you were in while you were doing all that writing. Because that's what we need. We need, part of this practice is about containment. It's like teaching us how to organize our feelings and emotions and contain them in a healthy way, which is vastly different than shoving them down. It's okay to put our feelings in a box, but in order to really do that successfully, we have to have transitions. So we want to transition away from the journaling practice by doing some kind of self-compassion. And that could be going for a walk, doing a little drawing, going for a swim. Physical things are helpful because they really help us with transitions. But really anything. I mean, you could just like love on your body for 10 minutes. It's anything that makes you feel good and helps you transition to a new activity. You also want to destroy the evidence of what you wrote. And you can do that before the self-compassion or after or as part of your self-compassion. And the purpose behind that is to literally destroy the evidence. You want to be able to make and keep the promise to yourself that no one is going to read what we've written. But even if, sometimes I get people asking like, oh, well, I live alone, or I live with my partner and I really trust her or him, or, and I trust that they are not going to read my stuff, or even if they did, they would understand because they're doing this work too. All the reasons that we might think it's not necessary to get rid of what we wrote. But it's again, like coming back to the gesture of that, the promise that we made to ourselves. Because if your subconscious mind doesn't trust that you're really going to do what you said you were going to do, or that it's really safe to share freely, then it just may not share. So we want to make sure that we get rid of everything. It's also a really powerful symbolic gesture of saying, I'm letting this go. I did all this writing, I processed all this stuff, and now it's part of my transition. I am compartmentalizing this stuff and I'm letting it go for today. And if it comes back, if I've got to write about it again, or a different aspect of it or something like that, that's okay. But for today, we're done. So that's the bulk of the practice. And then the 3 lists are just, like I said, they're prompts that we use in doing this work. And they are made up of our childhood experiences, childhood trauma. I also just call this kind of past events or patterns, because it's really, to me, it's anything up to like non-present happenings. It could be last year or even last month. And that's any pattern that you saw happening as a kid or any significant event. So a pattern example might be going to grandma's house was always a really stressful time, or being bullied at school, anything that was a pattern that repeated over time and had a significant effect on you. Also, obviously, events like when we had to move away from our hometown, or when I lost someone significant to me. And these things, as you write them on all 3 lists, you really just want to write a bulleted list. You don't want to get too much into the emotional aspect of it, because you want to be able to look at this and not be, totally triggered just by looking at it. But with that said, I will say that the 3 list is a place of big resistance for a lot of people. And so if it does not have to be the first thing you do, it's not the priority so much as the JournalSpeak work itself. So be gentle with yourself and don't feel like you have to do it all at once. The second list is so present day triggers or day-to-day stressors. That could be anything like work or family or grocery shopping, anything that causes you stress in the day-to-day. And then the third list is often referred to as personality traits. And then I also include core beliefs or worldview. So these are things that you have come to, hold strongly to, whether it's things that you believe about yourself or things that you believe about the world or other people. So some examples might be a belief that I'm a perfectionist, or a belief that relationships are hard. Anything that we just have, decided to take on sort of as part of our identity. So the reason we give you, very specific parameters around time and space and all of that is to give guidance, is to give structure to the parts of us that love structure. We really need structure in our lives. And so it's a tool, but absolutely, we want to figure out a way to make it work for us. And so I think that's a great idea, to just like to meet yourself halfway in a sense and say like, okay, well, let's just try it on, and then see how it goes. I think that's fantastic. And because also when I'm encouraging people to do JournalSpeak every day, for example, for 20 minutes and all of that, my wish for you is not that you will have to do JournalSpeak every day for the rest of your life in order to maintain, a healing experience. My wish for you is actually that it will continuously become more and more flexible and natural in the way that you talk to yourself, think about yourself, and experience your life. So for me, I don't journal every day at this point. I do it more as needed. And there are times when I go into daily JournalSpeak flow because that's needed. But a lot of times what what happens for me and what I get so excited to hear about from my clients and anyone else who shares their process with me is that we learn how to do journal speak in the moment, without paper, without a closed door, without, all the trappings of the practice. And sometimes we do, I still do 20 minutes, I close the door, I do my whole thing sometimes as I need that level of containment and sort of intensity and approach. But a lot of times what happens for me now is like I was saying earlier, I'll be in a situation and it's like, oh, wow, that just like totally brought up all kinds of old stuff about like friends from grade school that like, drama, so, whatever. And I'm thinking about it now, but I'm in this situation with this, grocery store clerk and I can't fully process this right now, but I'm going to come back to it later. Or I'm going to just give myself pause to just notice that pattern. Like, wow, the way she said that reminded me of that old stuff. And it immediately brought up like anger in me. Wow, I might need to look at that later. Or I might just like need to let that flow through me right now. And then that's it. I'm able to get back into that conversation or, treat that person as just themselves and not like all that old stuff that's coming forward. So I think playing with it, being flexible with your practice is a great way of starting to trust yourself, to know how to make this work for you. So I think that's awesome. So these are my examples that I use for things you might put on your 3 list. And what I recommend people to do is to start trying to make connections. And you can I have this in my, if you have my JournalSpeak resource pages that I gave you guys on the Kajabi platform, I have this written out if that's helpful. But basically you can make a statement like, because mother left us when I was a child, now I believe that relationships are stressful. And because I have that belief that relationships are just stressful, I have social anxiety triggers that come up in the present day. And that is like starting to understand where we picked things up from in the first place is what starts to really give us the agency to put them down. And when we look around, I think what's really helpful in terms of answering the question of like, what's normal or like, what's everybody else thinking in these situations is start watching people, and look to people who you admire or who you see as handling things well, whatever that means, but just start looking around and kind of exploring, this is how I feel about this thing or this person or this relationship. How would I prefer to feel? Or if I were Caroline, how does she feel about that? Or how would Phil respond to this kind of situation? And when we start kind of opening our mind to explore our options is what starts really helping us to notice the difference and to then start processing so that we can create changes and interrupt those patterns for ourselves. Because that's so much of what's happening. We get into a pattern early in life and it served us well at that time. It was a great mechanism for safety and protection. But we get to a point later on where we're like, okay, this isn't serving me. This is just making me sad or stressed or whatever it is, or it's causing me pain. And I have to find a way to interrupt that pattern, whether it's in new relationships or in changing, the way I look at things or think about things. And that's, again, like so much of what JournalSpeak is helping us to do. It's like changing the way that we think about things. A lot of times when it comes to resistance, the worst thing we can do is resist the resistance and like try to force ourselves to do something that we're not ready to do or we're not feeling good about. And, and then we are in war with ourselves over trying to help ourselves. And that's really not what we're after. And so I think it's actually great to make space for yourself when you're not feeling like doing anything, about this work. Because there's something healing about that too, about just giving yourself a break and not being so pressured to get things done or to do it right or to, whatever, check off the checklist, all those things. And I find that the sooner I'm willing to do that and just be okay with it and not be hating on myself at the same time that I'm allowing the resistance to happen, when I just make space for that, then it's easier to loosen up. It's easier to get into it when we're ready, when we've had enough of that, pushback kind of experience. And so I think it's really, really important to give yourself, the credit for that, and to celebrate just showing up for yourself in whatever way does feel okay or safe or good to do. And I think it's really great that you're aware of yourself, noticing these things and just giving yourself time and space to acclimate to your process. So sometimes we need a break, or sometimes our system just needs a bit of a reset to know that we're going to be doing this work from a place of tenderness and love and healing, not from a place of like, go, 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 you've got to, get it done and get it over with kind of thing. Because this is what we do. If we have something going on, external stressors going on, or internal stressors going on, we have this tendency in a lot of cases to kind of turn on ourselves about it, or, put this, well, I should be doing better, or I should be feeling better, I should be journaling more, I should be, showing up, like whatever the thing is. And we have to navigate a little bit of, pushing and nudging outside of our comfort zones around things, but we want to be really careful to not be unkind to ourselves, because then, first of all, we're most likely playing out some old pattern in the moment that we're doing that. It's really helpful to think in that when we hear ourselves being critical or, pressuring or stressing on ourselves, it's really helpful to think of like, who does that sound like? Who have I heard before talk to me that way, or talk to themselves that way in the past or outside of my own head? And how might I be just kind of playing out that pattern within myself, that in a way that's just not serving me anymore? What does it mean to fully process an emotion? For example, something that pops up and reminds me of something from the past, and that's why it's triggering me. How do we process the initial trauma so that if it feels like we just keep returning to that same old pattern? This is a great question. This is a little bit of like the question to doing this mind body healing work. And it's a question I get a lot from a lot of people about, how do I know when the thing has been processed? So I mean, the simple answer is the way that we process the emotional content from those traumatic experiences is through things like JournalSpeak, journaling and writing it out, finding a way to express how you are feeling about that story or that experience now, as well as how you were feeling back then, or how you weren't safe to feel back then, is really the key, because that's kind of the whole problem. We shove things down, we learn to repress and suppress our emotional experiences, and they come back up through the body later. So our job really is to just find a way to express those things, to move them through and out of our mind-body system. So what I usually recommend for people in terms of kind of zeroing in on JournalSpeak as a significant tool, is that you make sure to journal about and express yourself around the initial trauma, if you know what it is in as many angles as possible. And what I mean by that is, sometimes, if something bad happened when we were a kid, like something that was really scary, then we might automatically assume that the feeling we need to work through in response to that initial trauma is fear, which makes sense and would be good to do. But there's also very much possibility that there's also disappointment in there. There's also anger in there, frustration, confusion. There could be a sense of betrayal between you and the person who was involved in that story, or who didn't get involved in that story with you. So it's really useful to make sure that we're looking from all the emotional angles that we can about any old event, and make sure we're giving ourselves room to feel more than one thing about an event. I also often recommend that people write about it from different perspectives. So writing about it from your present moment perspective, your adult self looking back on that past event and writing about how it feels for you now, but also writing about that event from that age you's perspective. So letting, if it was actually in childhood, letting that inner child come forward and speak up for all the things they didn't get to say or feel at that time. And also it can be really helpful, especially for those of us who struggle to get in touch with emotion, to really feel the feelings. Sometimes it's really useful to write about the story from a third person's perspective. So, and I think Nicole talks about this too, and she calls it reporter style writing. So you write, this is the story about Caroline. She's 6 years old and she lives in this town, and she's got, these family members living with her. And one day she goes to school and, someone just really lays into her, total bully, fiasco. And just kind of like getting into the story from that third person perspective sometimes really helps us to get in touch with the emotions, because we've learned how to disconnect from our own emotional experience. But we often have this really strong empathy that we are able to feel for others. So using that third person voice can help us get in touch that way. It can also be helpful, a little bit strange, but helpful to write from the perspective of someone else who was present. So if there was a family member or a friend or teacher, someone around at that time, kind of writing from their perspective about that version of you and that story of what happened. Very similar to the previous example, it just can sometimes really help us to get into a more objective perspective of the emotionality of that experience and how someone else might have looked at it if it's a little too tough to look at it directly ourselves. So that's my number one tip, is to look at things from as many angles as possible and as many emotional, kind of avenues as possible as well. And then when it comes time to ask the question of how do I know when I have processed the trauma or the trigger itself, the answer really is in your experience of the triggering. So if you've got a pattern around, a challenging relationship with your sister, and up until now, every time the phone rings and you see her name come up on the caller ID, you just wow, go into tremors and fits. You'll know that you still have stuff lingering around that pattern, around that relationship, and whatever it means to you. So you will want to go back and keep writing about that, particularly the past stuff, but also how it's coming up for you now. And when you've done enough of that processing and expression, you'll start to notice that you behave differently in response to those same triggers. And you'll be more able to have in that example, a conversation with your sister about today without, lugging along this weight of all this past stuff that had never been addressed before. If we notice we're not responding or acting in the way that we would like to, if we're not feeling the way we want to feel about something, how do we stop that reaction? How do we change that? And this is it's another thing where it's it's simple, but not easy. And it really does take practice. So the first thing we have to do, like I was saying, is through JournalSpeak, that's how we figure these things out. That's how we come to realize that we have a pattern that we're playing out that's no longer serving us. And we get to, drudge up all the feelings and process that and then start to explore how we would prefer to feel about that situation, or what we would prefer to believe about ourselves or the world or the situation. And then in those moments where we get triggered is where we get to practice. And I think the most important thing we can do for ourselves is before even getting pushy or trying to do it different, start by noticing what's different. So for example, when people come into session with me and they tell me like, well, same old story, somebody is out there being mean to me, bullying me again, and I don't understand why I keep getting stuck in the same pattern. My question is, what was different this time? Because there's no way as we go through this process that we can always stay in the same exact place, in the same exact reaction, the same exact response. When we're doing this work, when we're looking at things more objectively, we are always changing and progressing. So we want to make sure that we're giving ourselves credit for any sliver of difference first, and then expanding on that. So if, like the example I gave earlier of like, when my sister calls me, like I, go into like tremors just by seeing her name on the phone, maybe next time I'll notice that I didn't do it right away. First I saw her name and I took a deep breath, and then I did start having some anxiety coming up. But just those little differences, or I didn't answer the phone, I was like, nope, not doing it. Notice what you're able to do differently in your response right away. And then as you're giving yourself credit for that, you grow in your strength and your ability to actively change things, to refuse to answer that call, or to answer it differently, or to change your belief. So, big, powerful practice that we can start working with is saying, when a pattern comes up, like I gave that example before from the 3 lists. My example was, because my mother left us when we were kids, I believe that relationships are just stressful. And whenever social stuff comes up, I get anxiety today. My approach to that, when I'm good and ready to start thinking about change around that, is the question is, what do I choose to believe instead? Well, I've seen examples out there of people who have relationships that are not just stressful to them. I know this is possible for a person like me. And so I choose to believe that relationships are healing, and they have the power to be, good, feel good, and bring goodness to me, not just drain me of everything. And when we get those new beliefs kind of highlighted, kind of narrowed down, then we can also bring those into the present moment. When something's triggering me, when that phone rings and my sister pops up and I normally would respond with anxiety, I can say to myself, okay, this is because of old stuff. I'm feeling triggered about old stuff, about relationships being stressful. And my expectation is that she's going to unload a world of, worry on me or something. But I choose to believe that my relationships can be healing and good and connective and fulfilling. And so I'm either going to not engage with this because it's not going to be fulfilling for me right now, and I'm not in a place to handle it or set a boundary or whatever. Or I'm going to answer this phone call I'm going to center myself, and I'm going to calm down a little bit and move and breathe and just move myself into a different state, and trust that whatever is coming through is an opportunity for me to connect with this person and to be fulfilled and give fulfillment. And I'm going to practice with that. And it's so important that we stay open and that we know that it's a practice, because the first time you pick up, that call from that person, it may not be a deeply fulfilling and healing relationship experience, but you want to start to notice the way you feel going into it and how you can manage your beliefs and your thought process and your behaviors. And you will see change start to happen in a lot of these situations, but it's incremental, and we've got to be willing to celebrate every little, pinch of progress that we make along the way. So the other piece that kind of came along with that question about JournalSpeak was, what happens if I feel worse after doing JournalSpeak or starting JournalSpeak? Is it normal for the system to sort of rebel in some way? And the short answer is yes, very normal. This is probably the toughest part about doing this work, is that very often it does bring up more, and there's a few different reasons for that. I think one is that the system is, it's trying to protect you based on what has worked so far. And so when we come into doing mind-body healing work, we're saying we're going to look directly at emotions. We're going to do the thing that our system has been trying to help us avoid doing for however many years. And when we make that decision, a lot of times the system does respond with saying, no, like, no, not a good idea. This is the whole thing. This is the whole problem. We're not doing this. Let me do my best to grab your attention and pull it somewhere else so that you might back down from this really scary step that you're trying to take. The other thing that often happens is that when you open the door and when you say to your subconscious mind, I'm here, I'm seeing more clearly now, I'm learning, I'm gathering these tools, and I'm here, and I want to know what's been going on, what's been trapped inside. We're opening up the space to find all this out. Sometimes the subconscious mind goes, oh, thank you. Okay, well, we've got this and this and this and this, and it just, and everything starts coming to the surface, because it really is almost like your body's way of, celebration is the wrong word, but it's like this outpouring of response to say, thank God you're here. And, and what can we do to soothe ourselves? If you're finally willing to really look at me in this new way, then I'm going to give you everything I've got. So it's really important that we keep those things in mind, and that we are aware that it is totally normal. But in my understanding, the most important part about how we address the symptoms as they're coming up at any point in the process is to pay really close attention to the emotion that they bring up. So less on the actual physical thing itself, but more about how we feel towards it and our attachment to it. So because when the body's using physical manifestation as a defense mechanism, as a protection mechanism, it's trying to get our attention on that area of the body through sensation or symptom of some kind. And if we're going to operate on the program that it's running of kind of redirecting our attention to the physical, then we're giving up the opportunity to unearth the emotional aspect. So we really want to focus in on the emotional side of things as much as possible. And what I have found over and over and over again through my personal practice with this work, and also with many, many of my clients, is that very often the way we feel emotionally towards a symptom is a reflection of something else that we feel that way towards, or aren't able to feel that way towards, really, really need to process. So, which I think is a beautiful, kind of twist on a lot of what comes up in the TMS community is we see pain or symptom as a distraction. But I think that it's more of a redirection. So if my subconscious mind believes that it's not safe for me to share or express or even look at the anger I have towards my brother, it might be safer for me to look at the anger I have towards my right knee. And so it's giving us this opportunity to process our emotions towards ourselves in the safety of our own body, rather than, going out to those places where we've experienced it to be kind of unsafe. So if we can deal with the emotional aspect that comes up around the system, we can, the symptoms, we can really help ourselves to be doing the work in that way as well. Do we always have to journal about bad stuff? Can we journal about positive things too? And my answer to that is yes, please, please open yourselves up and make space to write about good things, write about what you want, write about your vision for where you're going with this work, why you want to heal, because you want to get back to whomever and whatever it is that you love and are passionate about. My only caveat to that recommendation is to, again, just like always being, checking ourselves and noticing where we're at. So that positive writing, I think it's really powerful to do stream of consciousness writing in the same way, like putting your pen down and not picking it up for a certain period of time, even on the positive. But we just want to be aware that that's technically different practice than journal speak as we know it. Still good to do, but we want to be aware of when we might be avoiding, it's like, if I'm not feeling it today, I'd rather write about something positive than doing my journal speak practice. I just want to check in with myself and be like, well, is that because what I need today is to generate some positivity in myself and to focus on the good and bring some of that forward? Or is what I need today to look at some of this ugly, hairy, messy stuff and I'm just scared or not feeling it? And then what can I do to, help myself get what I need, and be, kind of answering my needs in that way rather than avoiding or resisting through something like that. So I hope that makes sense and is helpful as well.